I'm going to get us started in the faith and hope that you can see and hear me if you're online. My name is Rob Rosenthal. I'm professor of the Department of Religious Studies and the founding director of the Center for Global Islamic Studies. And today is an auspicious day because of our guests, but also because this is the first event we've managed to host in 3 dimensions and fleshing lives for over 18 months. Knowing that there's a culture shift, that some students are reluctant to come and others never quite knows, we're also hybrid today. So I'm pleased to welcome students and others coming to us on Zoom. The chat room will be up and functioning, and I'll be checking it. So if you have trouble seeing or hearing or have questions along the way, let me know. I want to introduce with great pleasure Dr. Sahar, an associate professor in the Department of Communication and affiliate professor in the Department of Women's Studies and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland College Park. She's an expert on Arab and Muslim media and the former head of the Mass Communications Department at the University. She holds a PhD in Mass Media and Cultural Studies from the University of Manchester in the UK. So you're seeing the global and she's also a former Mellon Islamic Studies Initiative visiting professor at the University of Chicago. Co-author of the books Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, and Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, and co-editor of the book Arab Women's Activism, Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gender Revolutions. Beyond these books, she has a number of book chapters, journal articles, conference papers, regionally and internationally, both published in both Arabic and English, and is a well-known media commentator, analyst, public speaker, radio host, and former Human Rights Commission. I've never met her, so 30 minutes ago, but I feel like I have because we are together working on a book coming out, inshallah, in April, called Cyber Muslims. She has a really interesting chapter in that book. And I'm pleased to say that we'll be doing this again in the flesh, real time and real space in April, a 3-day conference that you'll hear a lot more about in the weeks and months ahead. So thanks to those who are here, thanks to those who joined us online, and let's go. Welcome, Professor Sahar. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you at Lehigh University for the first time, and hopefully not the last time. I want to really sincerely thank Professor Rob Rosenthal for the kind invitation and thank the Center for Global Islamic Studies at Lehigh University for this great opportunity. And I'm very much looking forward also to coming back again to this campus in the spring to actually discuss my chapter that Professor Rob just mentioned in this great new volume. I'm very much looking forward to seeing actually in print and celebrating it with all the other co-authors in this volume. So my presentation this afternoon is going to be about modern Muslim digital struggle, countering Islamophobia on social media. A lot of my work has been dealing with 2 lines of research. Some of it has been dealing with the Arab media and Arab media landscape, especially in the context of the aftermath of the Arab Spring uprisings and cyber activism and the use of social media and new media in the Arab world for the purpose of bringing social and political transformation. And another line of parallel research has had to do with the theme of Muslim identities in cyberspace, which indeed was the topic of my first co-authored book, Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace. And since then, I've been also touching on issues related to the construction of Muslim identities in cyberspace as it relates to gender identities, as well as also different discourses related to Islamophobia and countering Islamophobia, which is the topic I chose to focus on this afternoon. So we're going to be talking about different definitions of Islamophobia, also the context for growing Islamophobia, the causes of Islamophobia, the different waves of Islamophobia in the US, mainstream American media Islamophobia, the internet as a double-edged sword when it comes to Islamophobia, some successful online campaigns, as well as some of the right and wrong approaches to dealing with this issue of Islamophobia. So when we start to talk about the different definitions of Islamophobia, the idea of fearing a certain group of people because of their culture, belief, or because they're different is not a new thing. It has been there for a long time, for many centuries, and this process of ethnic, racial, or religious profiling has been commonly referred to as stereotyping. Therefore, it could be said that Islamophobia, which is characterized by an exaggerated sense of dislike and hostility towards Islam and Muslims, is a new word for an old problem. So the term itself may be relatively new, but the concept of hatred towards others, with a capital O, is not a new one for sure. In the book, The Politics of Islamophobia, the term is defined as an increasingly visible backlash against Muslims across Europe and the US. The term backlash in this case encompasses all negative acts and messages against Muslims. Under this definition, acts do not have to cause bodily harm alone, they can also cause mental and psychological harm as well. So when you're talking about the concept of Islamophobia, it can be something like, somebody attacking a mosque, a masjid or an Islamic center, or taking off the scarf from the hijab from a Muslim woman's head. But it can also be, different ways of using certain terms or certain terminology, or a dirty look at someone, or treating them differently. All of that can also cause mental and psychological, not just physical or bodily harm. On the Gallup website, Islamophobia is defined as exaggerated fear, hatred, and hostility towards Islam and Muslims that is perpetuated by negative stereotypes resulting in bias, discrimination, and the marginalization and exclusion of Muslims from social, political, and civic life. So there's also an element of, feeling excluded or, not really integrated sufficiently. We see that more in Europe. When you talk, for example, about a country like France, we see the struggles of some of the French Muslims and how they feel like there is this type of exclusion for their way of life. And we're going to talk in a minute about also the ban on the hijab and the ban on the niqab, which is the face covering and so on. So Sean Armstrong, in his book Islam, a Religion of Peace and Inconvenient Truth, takes a different approach to defining Islamophobia, because he wants to include what specific parts of Islam brought fear into the hearts of others. His definition was it's an allegedly irrational fear of losing life or liberty to Islamic rule, merely because the laws and sacred texts and traditional practices of Islam demand the submission of culture, politics, and religion, and also a social expression. So this definition then, unlike the previous ones, mentioned term losing life and losing liberty when it comes to fear of Islam. So when we talk about things like people who are using terms like jihad, or using terms like Sharia or Sharia law, or, oh my God, these Muslims are going to create Sharia zones, right? So oftentimes without a proper understanding, even for these terms like jihad or terms like Sharia, and what they actually mean and what they actually entail, right? That in a way is like, oh, we're going to lose our own way of life, our own freedom, because these dangerous, exotic Muslims are going to come over and they're going to change the way society functions and the way society operates. There's also definitely a social construct, right? Reintroducing also in this case a reintroducing and reaffirming global social structures through which resource distribution disparities are maintained and extended. This definition accounts for Islamophobia globally, because it's not present in just one society, but rather across Europe, the US, and many other parts of the West. This explains, for example, the fear of immigration, right, or immigrants, under the claim that, oh my God, they're going to come and they're going to take over the economy. They're going to take over our jobs. They're going to replace us, right? So as if Islam and Western civilization are not compatible. They cannot exist side by side. So you see rhetoric like clash of civilizations, the West versus the rest, the Muslim travel ban, all of that stuff has been an attempt to push back against some kind of perceived threat that's coming from, quote unquote, these exotic, brown, dark-skinned Muslims who are going to come from overseas and they're going to take over the economy and everything, the jobs and everything. So let's push back against that by having very restrictive laws and regulations when it comes to immigration and other aspects. Another report attributed the unfounded hostility towards Muslims and therefore fear or dislike of all or most Muslims to a new emerging paradigm, which is characterized by some level of aversion, fear, or hatred towards Muslims in general, because of the extreme acts of a few radicalized individuals in society. It stems from a lack of understanding of the Muslim faith and stereotypes imposed on an entire population because of the acts of a very small, minute, faction or group. So ignorance is really the heart of the problem here. That's what I want to highlight, right? The people are always the enemies of whatever they are ignorant about. We always fear whatever we are ignorant about. Actually a survey or some kind of study that has been conducted by ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, they do an annual poll, right? Some kind of survey of attitudes toward American Muslims. And they found a very interesting fact that if you get to know just one single Muslim, just one person, a neighbor, a friend, someone who lives next door, works with you, a colleague, that in and of itself reduces the level of Islamophobia tremendously. Just imagine one single Muslim actually meet. And I would say the same is also applicable to other racial, religious, and ethnic groups, right? If we talk about, anti-Semitism, right? You have a Jewish friend, that can definitely change any kind of anti-Semitic attitude you might have, or, hatred to blacks or Latinos or immigrants in general. I think that getting to know people definitely helps, and definitely, overcoming this kind of ignorance that creates fear of the other is extremely important. So you're seeing here some examples, just to give you some examples of some of the terrible rhetoric that has been, demonstrations and protests, like, no to terrorism, no to Islam, stop the invasion, stop the mosque. Islam is the new Nazism, right? So you've been seeing some of these horrible, slogans and protests and demonstrations and so on. You remember, of course, the resistance to, the Ground Zero mosque, right? And all of the stuff which happened around this particular controversy. And things are actually a lot worse in Europe, I should say. The US has had its fair share of Islamophobia. We're going to talk about it, like different ways of Islamophobia in the US. But I would say in general, things have been much worse when it comes to the Muslims in Europe and what they have been and still are suffering from up till this moment. So according to a Gallup poll, for example, globally, many Muslims report that they do not feel respected enough by those in the West. 52% of Americans, 48% of Canadians say the West does not respect Muslim societies. Smaller percentages of Italian, French, German, and British respondents agree to that. So there is some kind of, when you do these kinds of surveys, of course, you always take it with a grain of salt because, when was it conducted? This one, I think, was 2018. So, I mean, if we get a 2021 data, maybe it's going to change a little bit, but it shows you some kind of feeling that there hasn't been sufficient respect. So the 4 waves of Islamophobia in the US, if we zoom in particularly on the United States in particular, there have been different waves of Islamophobia in the US. The first one came with, or I should say surged with, the Iran hostage crisis that took place, of course, during the time of President Carter. The second wave was, of course, after 9/11, although I would say here a very important point that somehow 9/11, as horrible as it was, and as much as associated Arabs and Muslims with the terms terrorism and terrorists and extremism, it also had a silver lining, believe it or not. So a lot of people became very interested to learn more about the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the Middle East, and they started to read about them. Oh, who are these Muslims? I want to know, more about Islam. Let me study the Arab world. So even centers for Arab studies and Islamic studies, like the one here at Lehigh University and many other places around the country, started to welcome scholars. I myself was hired under one of these searches at the University of Maryland. They were looking specifically for a scholar on Arab and Middle Eastern media. So in a way, it did create some kind of interest in studying Islam, Muslim, and the Arab world in the Middle East. Although I would also say that one caveat here we should be aware of or careful about is that many of these studies also focus narrowly on the concept of terrorism and countering terrorism, which is why it's very important to grow out of this cocoon, out of this bubble, and to extend your studies beyond, oh my God, let's talk about Islam, then let's talk about countering terrorism, as if nothing happens, among the 1.8 billion Muslims around the world, except if it has to do with terrorism or countering terrorism. So it's very important to break out of this cocoon and to present different types of Muslim identities, Muslims as they live their lives as ordinary people everywhere around the world. The third wave, of course, came with attacks in Paris, San Bernardino, California, Orlando, Florida, and escalated significantly with the presidential campaign in 2016 and the rhetoric that started to come along with it. And we saw a surge in Islamophobia in that particular case that really was very aggressive and was also somehow amplified through the use of mainstream media as well as social media. And we're going to talk about social media in particular as one of the key, of course, areas of focus for this particular lecture. And I would add a fourth wave just this year in 2021, which came with the 20th anniversary of 9/11, of the 9/11 horrible attacks, as well as also the Afghanistan crisis. So I will say that these two most recent factors, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, as well as the Afghanistan crisis, also were recent factors that somehow played a role in creating what we can describe as the most recent wave of Islamophobia. So mainstream Western media and Islamophobia, many mainstream Western media outlets spread negative images, distorted stereotypes, and hate speech against Muslims, linking them to acts of violence, extremism, and terrorism. Although, for example, Gallup surveys and Pew Research and others have noticed that, or have recorded that 96% of terrorist attacks on U.S. soil were committed by people who have absolutely nothing to do with Islam or Muslims. In fact, most of these terrorist attacks were committed by right-wing white supremacist groups. But that's not what you see in the media. What you see in the media is that if someone with a Muslim name, right, looks like a Muslim or has a Muslim name or an Arab name, commits one of these acts, then immediately this person is identified and his faith tradition is immediately recognized, and oh my God, this person is from Morocco, and he happens to be a Muslim, right? And that doesn't happen with those who are right-wing extremists and white supremacists, who represent the majority, the sweeping majority of terrorist attacks committed on U.S. soil. So the wide outreach of the media venues and the immediate instant transmission magnified the impact on the audience, right? Because there are millions of viewers on TV, people who are going to watch the news, and they're going to immediately say, yeah, I've seen this guy, his name is Ahmed, he did this horrible terrorist attack, and his name was mentioned, oh, he's a Muslim. So think about the amplifying effect of the mainstream media, and of course, the social media as well, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. So this in turn resulted in an escalation in acts of violence and hatred against Muslims globally, especially in the West, including attacks on mosques, Islamic centers, women wearing the hijab or the Muslim headscarf like myself. According to a Pew survey, these attacks have increased by 67% in the US after the election of former President Donald Trump. This is also coupled with a narrow focus on terrorism in international mainstream media, which is linked to the principle known as when it bleeds, it leads. So this is a very important thing, because mainstream media, unfortunately, adopts this principle, meaning whenever you have conflict, bloodshed, violence, people are killing each other, there is war, there's conflict, you get the cameras rolling, the media is interested, the headlines are made, and people are, really listening and watching. So the media figured out, yeah, if I want to increase my viewership, right? I'm going to get more audiences. I'm going to get more, viewership. I'm going to also focus on this principle of when it bleeds, it leads. Focus more on violence and conflict. Although I always say, I'm 100% sure there are good people, good Muslim people, good, Jewish people, Black people, Asian people who are doing good things every single day somewhere. But the media does not really care a lot about showing them or really shedding light on what they are doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it. It's much more interested in conflict and violence, and that in itself also feeds into this process of hatred towards others. The internet and Islamophobia, a double-edged sword. Indeed it is. So it could be said that the waves of Islamophobia which were witnessed in the US are a double-edged sword for American Muslims. On one hand, it did increase bias, prejudice, discrimination, and hate crimes against Muslims. On the other hand, increased interest in learning about Islam and Muslims to an unprecedented degree, and it increased solidarity with Muslims as well. Just like I said about 9/11 being a double-edged sword, on one hand, it increased the the hatred towards Muslims and Islam and linking them to acts of terrorism and extremism, but on the other hand, increased interest. The same could be said about, for example, the Muslim Travel Ban 1, Muslim Travel Ban 2, because you saw Americans going out and marching and saying, not under my name. Muslims are my neighbors. I want them to be free, and I want them to come in my country. And this is a country of immigrants, and people holding banners and marching against these types of policies. You also saw this. The other flip side of the coin and the silver lining in the dark cloud was the solidarity, which increased also with Muslims. Likewise, one can argue that the internet, with all of its unfiltered content, can sometimes harm Muslims and negatively affect their image and reputation. For example, you have a Twitter campaign such as #BanIslam, which try to shed light on Islamic extremism in a new digital world where information exchange happens instantly and freely. It is impossible to stop or to censor these types of campaigns entirely. So yes, if you are an Islamophobe and you want to create some kind of account, right, really fueling some kind of Islamophobia or using it to spread the message, you can reach millions of people in a very short time. However, the internet also offers unique and unprecedented opportunities for Muslims to respond and to react to these particular efforts and campaigns using the very same digital tools through launching countering Islamophobia campaigns in cyberspace. What you are seeing really is some kind of push and pull mechanism, as if it's a tug of war. One party can start to use the internet for the purpose of creating hatred, like the hashtag Ban Islam campaign and others, right? And profiling Muslims. The whole 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide are committing some form of terrorist act or some kind of evil act, which of course is completely untrue. But at the same time, those who are countering Islamophobia and pushing back against Islamophobia can start their own campaigns and use social media and new media for the purpose of countering Islamophobia at the same time. So some successful online campaigns. In response to many of the Islamophobic efforts and campaigns, American Muslims started to rely on cyber activism, which is the phenomena of course, using the internet to advance causes which are difficult to advance offline by starting their own countering Islamophobia campaigns online. This is a phenomenon that some started to use the term e-jihad or electronic digital online struggle. Of course, the term jihad, like the term sharia, unfortunately, as I said earlier, is widely misunderstood, and sometimes it's used like, oh my God, these Muslims are going to start jihad, we're going to come after the non-Muslims and try to forcibly, convert them to Islam and all of that. And I always say the word jihad actually means struggle, right? So your struggle can be losing 25 pounds, which is a huge struggle, or it can be, for example, jogging or running 2 miles a day, or it can be getting straight A's in all your classes if you're a student, whatever it may be. But it was taken out of context to refer to, oh my God, this is something scary and horrible, and these Muslims are coming after you, and so on. But some people use the term jihad, meaning like electronic struggle or digital struggle, to push back against Islamophobia. For example, Unity Productions Foundation released a YouTube video, which I like a lot. It's a short one, but I would advise you to watch it at your own, convenience. It's called American Muslims: Facts versus Fiction, which fights some of the misconceptions about American Muslims, such as believing that they are newcomers to the US, or that they are all radicalized extremists, or that they are all Arabs. Right? One of the first things I tell my students in my Arab media course at the University of Maryland is not all Arabs are Muslim and not all Muslims are Arab, right? So we know that the biggest Muslim country, largest Muslim country in the world is a non-Arab country, it's Indonesia, right? And of course, in the Arab world, there are non-Muslims, there are Christians, and there are Jews, and there are Jews, and so on. So there are different religions as well. But also the misconception of, oh, you're an American Muslim, you just came here yesterday. Well, guess what? American Muslims have been here since the very beginning of the foundation of the US, right? And the US was somehow built on the shoulders of some of these, Africans who were brought forcibly to the United States, many of whom were actually Muslims. So they were actually not newcomers. Many of them came here from the very beginning and the very foundation of this country. Also, the release of the hashtag Why Islam and the hashtag Discover Muhammad campaigns, which relied on a combination of both online websites as well as billboards together. So I'm going to show you a few examples here. So, for example, this campaign, Looking for the Answers in Life, Discover Muhammad, is a campaign that started online, but also was supplemented with billboards in the streets. Also, this one, Jesus is the Prophet of Islam, right? Something that not very many people know, but I was giving a talk in a church the other day, and I said, guess what? Every Muslim has to believe in Jesus Christ, has to believe in Virgin Mary, and the immaculate birth of Jesus Christ, and they did not have a clue that there's a whole chapter in the Holy Quran that is actually called Maryam, right? And the whole chapter talked about the story of Virgin Mary and the birth of Jesus Christ. And every Muslim is required to believe in all the messengers and all the prophets of God in order to become a Muslim. Otherwise, the religion has a problem. They have an issue with their faith. So something like that, for example, again, they use the online campaign and they also use billboards. hashtag who is Muhammad, what questions get answers, why Islam. The thing that I want to stress here is the combination of both, the online as well as the billboards, right? Because not everyone is necessarily online 24/7. We assume that because we live in such an environment as intellectuals or academics, but we always have to realize something which is called digital divide, which means the gap between the technological haves and have-nots. Not everyone has access to 24/7 high-speed internet, and not everyone has digital literacy skills either. So having this kind of combination of both the online as well as the billboards means that you are reaching a much bigger and much wider audience in a much more effective way. Also, some successful online campaigns, Muslim users came up with a campaign called hashtag Muslim Rage to counter the anti-Muslim campaign, which was called hashtag Ban Islam. This hashtag highlighted the bias and hate Muslims received on an everyday basis in a very humorous, witty, and satirical way. So unlike the name Muslim Rage, you expect all people are angry. What they did actually is they did a very, very funny, very humorous campaign in order to push back against the Ban Islam campaign. So, for example, they said something like, oh, you know, if your son's name, if you're a Muslim, you're flying, you're in the airport, your son's name is Jihad, don't you dare go after him in the airport searching for him and going, Jihad, Jihad, because that's going to get you in trouble. Or if your best friend's name is Jack and you get on the flight, don't you dare say, hi, Jack, because obviously you know it's going to happen to you. So it was just so funny and so humorous. And they just basically kept sending all of these jokes, you know, that just people were just, they just loved it and they just went viral. Because obviously, when you're talking about difficult issues like Islamophobia, like, you know, racism, discrimination, bias, prejudice, these are not easy topics to talk about, right? So you put a little bit of humor and it's funny and you put a joke, people think about it, they think deeply, so then they accept it in a much more, you know, comfortable way than if you're just seriously talking to them in a very straight face, in a very serious manner, right? So you always say you can say things using humor that you cannot say otherwise. In fact, it could be said that they were wise enough, people who launched this campaign, and not to use, for example, anger or not to use, you know, some kind of aggressive response to the Ban Islam campaign, but they very successfully came up with this very funny and humorous campaign, because in a way, if they used some kind of angry or aggressive reaction, then that's going to play into the hands of Islamophobes, right? It's going to somehow give this terrible image of Islam and Muslims, and people are going to say, oh, you see, I told you, these Muslims are hateful, they're hard-hearted, they're aggressive, and here's the proof. Look what they're, you know, spreading on social media. Remind me of those who are very angry at the offensive cartoons against Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and then they started, you know, breaking the glass of certain windows or going out in the street and, you know, shouting aggressive slogans. And I always say you cannot defend the message of Islam by going against it, and you cannot defend the Prophet of Islam by going against his teachings, right? Because in this case, you're going to play into the hands of Islamophobes, because your acts are going to speak like, oh my God, these are the dangerous, hateful, aggressive Muslims I've always been warning you about. So it's never going to be a helpful approach. Another really successful example is how American Muslim women from different backgrounds and walks of life launched the Twitter campaign, hashtag Can You Hear Us Now, to respond to Trump's attack on Mr. Khizr Khan and his wife, Mrs. Ghazala Khan, for standing silent on stage behind her husband at the Democratic National Convention. So for those of you who are not aware of the incident, Mr. Khizr Khan and his wife were standing on stage during the Democratic National Convention, and a big picture was displayed on the screen of their son, who was actually a martyr because he lost his life, you know, defending this country as an American citizen. And Mrs. Khan did not talk; she was just standing there. And at that time, candidate Trump said, "Oh, and his wife was standing there silent. She was not talking; she was silent. Maybe she was not even allowed to talk." So somehow trying to reinforce the image or the stereotype of the silent, oppressed, suppressed Muslim woman who does not have a voice and cannot speak for herself. So this campaign was an attempt to counter this negative portrayal of American women, or Muslim women, in this case Muslim American women, as silent, oppressed, and invisible entities who have no voice and who need to be saved and rescued, right? We always call it the Save the Muslim Woman syndrome. How can we save Muslim women? How can we help Muslim women? So guess what? The best thing is to respect Muslim women and to try to understand them, period. Understanding is the best thing. There's no need to save anyone from anything, but we all need to understand and respect each other. So it could be said that Muslim American women use Twitter as a platform through which their own voices could be heard and their identities could be made visible and salient and prevalent. So basically, they started a campaign where they said something like, hashtag, I'm a professor, and when I'm in the classroom, I'm the only one who can speak, and I'm the only voice that can be heard in the classroom. Hashtag, can you hear us now? Right? Or I am now sending this tweet while my husband is taking care of the kids and doing the dishes. I'm a Muslim woman, I have an agency. Hashtag, can you hear us now? Or I am someone who works for NASA. I am a successful woman. When I talk at work, all my, colleagues, they listen to me and they listen to what I have to say. Hashtag, can you hear us now? So the campaign went on and on using this hashtag, can you hear us now, as a way to amplify Muslim women's voices and to say, we are far from silent. We're actually having an agency and we can speak for ourselves. More recently, some Muslim women launched another campaign called hashtag hands off my hijab, which started online to resist the hijab and niqab ban in France. Right? So you all know that in France, for example, there was this ban on the hijab, the ban on the niqab, which is basically now I'm wearing my niqab, right? The face veil. The whole world is wearing the niqab now because of COVID-19. We can make this argument, right, to the French government. Okay. So basically, some Muslim women started to launch this hands off my hijab campaign to say, hey, you have the slogan of, liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? Liberty and egalitarianism and fraternity. We cannot interfere in the way we decide or we choose to dress, because that goes against the very principles of the the French slogans. You either change the slogans or you change your policies, because both of them are not matching. They're not going hand in hand. Either change your slogan or your policy. And they started this international campaign, hashtag hands off my hijab, to say we have the right to choose how to dress. Another example is the Twitter campaign, hashtag Muslims report stuff, another very hilarious campaign, very funny. Which was launched by Muslim Americans in response to a presidential candidate Trump's answer to a question that was asked by a young Muslim woman during the second presidential debate. Right? This young woman stood up and she asked him, Mr. Trump, how are you going to deal with the issue of Islamophobia? And he responds to her, you see, every time you see something, you should report it. So basically, that immediately gives you the impression that, I'm a Muslim woman, there must be something dangerous in my first year, right? I just, you have to report it right away, or we have to report it because there's always something dangerous going on in the Muslim community. So he asked Muslims to take upon themselves the responsibility to report anything that they deem unusual or suspicious. So the campaign was very hilarious, witty, and very, very funny. So it had things like, my mom cooks the same soup every single day. I'm reporting her to the FBI. Hashtag Muslims report stuff. I went to my car dealer today and I actually took an extra piece of candy without him noticing. Hashtag Muslims report stuff. My brother never makes his bed, never tidies up his room. His room is always a mess. I'm reporting him to the authorities. Hashtag Muslims report stuff. So basically, we used humor again, very, very funny, hilarious, witty, and brilliant campaign to try to push back against the image or the misrepresentation of Muslims being scary, suspicious, potentially dangerous, and always prone to violence in a very witty and very smart and intelligent way, using humor again. Another effective campaign was the Islamophobic pill. Again, very funny. I'd love for you guys to actually, if you can, at your own leisure time, check out these campaigns online. They're just too funny. And I can't, of course, capture everything in the presentation time, obviously. But I would love for you to please check these campaigns. They're super funny. So the Islamophobic campaign was launched by CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations. It was a hilarious, sarcastic, and witty campaign, very tactful, suggesting that if you exhibit any signs of Islamophobia, diagnosed as excessive irrational fear of Muslims, you should start seeking a healing cure of the Islamophobic pill. And they designed this actual box of medication that looked like ibuprofen, but they called it Islamophobic. And they said, you can take this pill 3 times a day until your Islamophobic symptoms go away. If they don't, then try to visit the closest masjid, the closest mosque, reach out to your community, the Muslims in your community, get to know them so that the symptoms can actually vanish. So it was again using a very witty and very funny and humorous appeal to try to overcome the issue of Islamophobia. There's also the hashtag Muslims are speaking out. It was a campaign using different videos to try to create some kind of momentum that Muslims are actually speaking out and speaking up against violent extremism and against all forms of terrorism. So I participated in this campaign among many others from different walks of life, scholars, writers, intellectuals, imams, and so on. So do me a favor, whenever somebody tells you, why aren't Muslims speaking out against terrorism and extremism, please tell them that Muslims are speaking, but they're not heard. And what I mean by that is there are so many imams and religious scholars that have actually written, big letters, and a lot of documents condemning all forms of extremism and terrorism. That does not get covered in the media. There are Muslims in huge numbers that marched in many different places and walked in demonstrations, and they spoke out against extremism and terrorism, and then the media does not cover it. There's no attention, there is no coverage in the media. So they are speaking, but they're not being heard, and their message is not being amplified, which is a shame. So I want to really stress this point because it's very important. Because Muslims, whether they are journalists, scholars, professionals, or simply lay people, they have been raising their voices against extremism and terrorism, but unfortunately, that has not been sufficiently covered in the media. So all of these examples of social media activism explain why and how social media platforms such as Twitter, YouTube, and others provide excellent alternative venues for hearing alternative voices and alternative views and narratives which can counter Islamophobia. Of course, on the other hand, Islamophobes are also using it as well. You have, for example, the concept of cloaked Facebook pages. Right? Someone is going to create a fake account or a fake Facebook page and say, oh, the jihadis of Denmark, for example, right? And it turns out this guy's name was Michael Smith Jones or something. It was not someone who has anything to do with Islam and Muslims, but simply creating a closed Facebook account, meaning a fake account that tries to give the false impression it was created by someone who is a Muslim in order to create more Islamophobia. So it's really, really a double-edged sword effect, as I said before. So what are the goals and objectives of these campaigns? The objectives and the goals are to fight the negative and distorted media stereotypes and misrepresentations about Islam and Muslims, to fight the sweeping generalizations about Islam and Muslims through resisting the view that there is only one monolithic Muslim identity, culture, or lifestyle. I always say there are 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide. The Muslims in Pakistan are different from those in Egypt, from those in Indonesia, from those in India, from those in Canada, for sure, because we're living in different societies, and therefore we are very much also influenced by our surrounding culture and identity and so on. To promote better understanding and genuine awareness about Islam and Muslims, and to resist the gender profiling of Muslim women in particular, by emphasizing their strength, courage, resilience, empowerment, and public visibility, as we saw in the campaign hashtag Can You Hear Us Now, for example, to highlight the similarities and overlaps rather than the differences and distinctions between Muslims and non-Muslims. I always say our commonalities are much greater than our differences. What we have in common is much, much more than what separates us. But unfortunately, that's not what we see on TV, and that's not what we see in social media, and that's not what we see in politics. Unfortunately, there's a lot of interest in tearing us apart and making sure that we are in different camps, and that the gaps, the polarization, the division increases to a degree where we think that it cannot be bridged. But in reality, I always say our commonalities are much greater than our differences. That's something we should really bear in mind. So the right and wrong approaches in countering Islamophobia. The right approach is to be proactive rather than reactive. We always say the fire preventer is better than the firefighter, right? If you can prevent the fire, it's much better than fighting the fire. Prevention is always better than cure, which means spreading awareness and correct knowledge rather than being on the defensive or reacting to crisis. So Muslims also have a responsibility, meaning they need to be part and parcel of their own society. right? Engage in activities in their own everyday life, attend the parent-teacher association meeting, take care of the surrounding environment, also reach out to others, right? It's always a two-way street. It's always a two-way street. Even when I talk about things like profiling and stereotyping, it's a two-way street, right? People in the West can have negative stereotypes about Islam, Muslims, and Arabs. Guess what? People in the Middle East can have also negative stereotypes about Americans or Canadians or people in Europe. So it's always a two-way street. So also there's a need to have more engagement, more integration, more cooperation, know your neighbor, reach out to others from both sides, and be more actively engaged in community activities so people know who you are. You know who you are. So when they see this horrible representation or misrepresentation on the media, but that's not Dr. Ahmed, that's not Mr. Muhammad, that's not Mrs. Zainab, because I know them. They are my neighbors, they are my friends. Being open and frank about the problem of extremism and condemning terrorism without being excessively apologetic and overly ashamed. And this really is a very sensitive issue to a member of the Muslim community. Because somehow, unfortunately, people develop this psyche of being always on the defensive, or like, oh my God, there's going to be a terrorist attack on TV. Oh, I hope the person's name is not, Muhammad or Ahmed or Mahmoud. I think that the right approach is to say, we're against extremism, we're against radicalization and terrorism for sure. If something like that happens, I should not be the one to always feel like, oh my God, I should hide it and I should, somehow go into the closet, or somebody is going to point the finger of blame at me. That is not also a healthy approach. It's not a healthy psychological approach. So let's talk about the problem. Absolutely. There is a problem, oh yeah, but at the same time, the 1.8 billion Muslims cannot be constantly feeling on edge and on the defensive and overly ashamed and overly sensitive, because that's not a healthy and a good approach either. Avoiding violence, aggression, and offensive language and actions because they create more harm than good, and one cannot fight darkness with darkness, right? It's also not possible to defend Islam against accusations of violence by being violent, or to defend the Prophet of Islam by disobeying him. So when I gave the example of those who were angry at the cartoons, and they went out and they broke the glass or started to become angry or aggressive and so on, these types of approaches create more harm than good, because as I said, you cannot fight the darkness with darkness, you have to fight it with light, right? And I think it was Martin Luther King who said that, right? You cannot fight darkness, you have to fight it with light. So basically you have to create an environment where there can be positive interaction, there can be love, there can be acceptance, and you cannot use violence and aggression to do so. In fact, if you do, you are playing into the hands of Islamophobes and confirming their message rather than denying it. Using humor, which is always a very successful and effective tool, one can say things through humor which could not be said otherwise. And we saw that especially those very funny campaigns went viral on social media and people love them, which is a very healthy and a very good approach to use. So a final word, and that's my last slide, I promise you. An important point to bear in mind is that we cannot understand the phenomenon of Islamophobia as a detached or separate process from other interrelated ongoing phenomena, such as xenophobia, racism, white supremacy, sexism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination, prejudice, and hatred, which have been on the rise recently. I just think of Islamophobia as one branch of this evil tree. Just like we started the presentation saying, oh, Islamophobia is a new word for an old phenomenon, for an old process, right? So I think that all of these evils are somehow interrelated. Racism, sexism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, Islamophobia are all interrelated. They're part of the same evil tree. Having this broader outlook on this important issue enables us to contextualize it within the broader framework of multiple forms of injustice, and therefore facilitates coming up with innovative strategies to combat these ongoing multiple challenges collectively and holistically in a well-coordinated and well-orchestrated fashion. In other words, justice is not just for us. It's not just for Muslims. It's not just for Jews. It's not just for Blacks. It's not just for Asians. It's for everyone. And we have to work collectively, hand in hand, together in solidarity in order to overcome all of these evils together because we are all in this together. Thank you so much. I'm ready for your questions.
This is a intimate crowd, so we'll just do this very informally. I'm hoping everybody can hear me on Zoom, but I will type and let them know that they can submit questions online as well. So you just take the questions as you like, if that's okay. So.
Yeah, if anybody has a question, I'm more than happy to answer. So give me a chance to bring someone.
I have many questions. Well, first of all, thank you for a very engaging presentation. I have many questions, but I'll start with one. It's about this different ways of countering the homophobic messages in media. And I was thinking, particularly, I think your focus today was more on social media, right? But I was thinking about television, particularly a show like Rami on Hulu, which I find absolutely astounding in how it enables me, even someone who's been studying for a very long time, to look at it in a new way. So I wonder if you could comment, aside from Rami, are you aware of other similar efforts to sort of reframe Muslims in American society and to counter those homophobic messages?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting part about Rami in particular is that, it showed the life of this young man who's also living his life in a very Americanized way, right? And that in itself created two different reactions, like many things in life, right? There were those who were like, yeah, that's super cool. Because now we can see, this person who is not a saint or not acting in a way which is like very different from us. He's pretty much someone who is down to earth, can also make mistakes, can also, sin, can also live his life to the fullest. And somehow he is now making it closer to us as a Western audience or the American audience to actually see this kind of person as more like us. But of course, there were those who also did not like it for this very same reason. And they said, oh my God, this is even like, you're showing him in this way, but he's committing all of these things are not quote unquote necessarily between brackets, Islamic. So it reminds me pretty much of the process, for example, of the hijabistas, right? These women who are, which I actually talk about in the chapter in Rob's edited volume, the Cyber Muslims, right? So I talk about this concept of the hijabistas, right? These women who are pretty much like, fashion icons, and at the same time they're wearing the hijab. Again, that brings two different forms of reactions. There are those who are like, oh yeah, that's awesome. Being a woman who is modest doesn't mean you have to wear rags, doesn't mean you have to cover yourself from head to toe in an unstylish way. You can still be very stylish and very fashionable and at the same time modest. And then the flip side of the coin, those who are like, oh, look at, this model, how she's standing there in front of the cameras and we can almost see the details of her body. And then she's wearing the scarf. What kind of hijab is this in the first place? The hijab is supposed to be about modesty and so on. And she is now far from being modest. So there is this attempt to somehow, some modern Muslims, I would say, especially younger generation, trying to create this blending, if you will, right, of multiple identities, because we are complex beings. We are complex humans. We are not simple. God created us complex, and that's the beauty of our identity in its complexity and sometimes ambiguity as well. So the modern young Muslims, in particular, have had these, different trends now to try to blend different aspects of their own identity with, for example, Western context or way of life or fashion or dress or culture and pop culture. Some have really applauded these attempts, thinking, yeah, that's great, that's awesome. Let's see the humanity in them. Let's see that they're pretty much like us in the West. And then there's definitely the other reaction of like, but that's not modest enough and it's not religious enough. I think it was this one soap opera that was shown on American TV. If somebody can help me to remember the name, it was showed like an American family. I think it was called the All American Muslim or something like that. Can somebody remember the name?
That's All American.
All American Muslim. Okay,
it
so-
only lasted 1 season.
Yeah, it only lasted 1 season, exactly. So it was like a family, oh, they were not doing anything quote unquote Islamic. They were not shown praying in the mosque. They were shown like, let's, do some pancakes in the kitchen. Let's get ready for Halloween.
There was actually a reality. It was a reality show, not even like.
Exactly. And they're like, oh my God, we're gonna celebrate Halloween. I'm gonna, do my pancakes and so on. So I mean, there are these attempts, again, to create this kind of controversy, like many other things in life.
I'll feed you a question from one person on Zoom, and there are quite a few. What are some ways that non-Muslim people can fight Islamophobia in the US?
That's an excellent question. I think that the first and most important step that we all have to engage in is knowledge, right? As I said in the very beginning, that the worst enemy is really ignorance. People are always afraid of whatever they're ignorant about. So the first step is education and knowledge. And I always tell my students, like, you're super lucky because you have the whole world at your fingertips, right? It's true that we cannot get like proper Islamic knowledge from Sheikh Google, right? Because you're not always going to get authentic Islamic knowledge from Google, obviously, but you can get some at least basic facts, and you can try to search from so many different sources, and you have more ease in terms of access to information, and you can try to filter some of that information, because there's always the danger of also misinformation, disinformation. I talked about closed Facebook pages. So not everything that comes our way on social media is necessarily going to be factual or accurate or should be taken at face value. But at the same time, I remember when I was an undergraduate student, and that was many years ago. I will not say how many years ago. I will just say a few years ago. Let's put it this way. I used to go to the library and literally carry this pile of 15 to 20 books, like a big stack of books, and I can't even see where I'm going because I had all of these books. Nobody does that anymore. You can just go online and write, I want to find out the basic facts about Islam. How many Muslims are there in the world? Try to find out more information about Islam and Muslims. That is the number one step. The second step, which is equally important, is trying to make friendship with people who are from a Muslim background. Like I said, just knowing one single person who happens to be a Muslim decreases the amount of Islamophobia to a very significant degree. So imagine if you have more than one friend, right? Join interfaith groups. I remember more than one group that have, for example, Jews and Muslims together, like Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society, Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. So it's a wonderful opportunity to meet people from different faith traditions. Join interfaith groups. Get to know people in your community, create friendships, right? We spend way too much time now on our own cell phone devices. We are not investing enough time in interpersonal relationships and interpersonal communication. Get to know your neighbor, get to know your community, build genuine friendship, join interfaith organizations. If you have a chance to travel, absolutely travel. Travel and join study abroad programs. Cultural exchange, student exchange programs are a wonderful opportunity to also find out more. Go and spend a summer in Morocco or in Egypt or some Muslim country and get to know the beauty of the people and the culture and the religion.
Questions from the audience here? I had a question about this apologetics thing, because I understand that your passionate plea for engagement is important. Be proactive, not reactive. So silence is deadly, but at a certain point, responding is exhausting, right? I have many Muslim friends who have been engaged in interfaith dialogue over the years, and just describe, while it's simultaneously crucially important, it's also troubling at a certain point, because every time a bomb goes off, they're called to come and explain themselves or explain the community. Important work, but they feel like they never get sort of beyond that, right? And Nabil Ejhaibi, who's writing a chapter in our book, I forgot the exact title, but he's talking about this balance between the push for transparency and the right to opacity. In other words, opacity, to not be transparent. And in his argument is very complex and theoretically sophisticated, but he's basically saying we'll know we've made progress when Muslims are allowed to not be on display and to not even have to necessarily speak. So I guess that's not a question, it's a, or I'm trying to formulate it better as a question. But how do you balance this, that in impulse and the need to speak out and to engage others, with the simple fact that it's often not a two-way street or a balanced playing field?
But
Right.
that's an excellent point, Rob. Thank you for that, because it really touches a very sensitive chord here. It's indeed very much what you just described right now is indeed the pulse of a lot of Muslim communities. Even the campaign I mentioned, I said I participated in, which is called hashtag Muslims are speaking out, which is basically a campaign where Muslims are literally holding a sign that says, no terrorism. I'm a Muslim, I'm a professor, and I'm saying no terrorism. Then another Muslim shows up in the campaign, I'm a medical doctor, I'm a Muslim, and I'm saying no terrorism, right? So there has been this pressure, if you will, on Muslim communities like, oh, Islam is a religion of peace, and it really kind of defies or, terrorism or is against terrorism. Why doesn't Muslims speak out about it? Why don't they actually speak out? The campaign was created by the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, which is basically also involving Muslim and Jewish, folks working together to create this kind of momentum to say, guess what? They're speaking out. But as I said also in my presentation, it's a very complex issue. I totally agree with you because number one, in many cases they're speaking out, but they're not even being heard. So in many cases you are doing all of this talking, and condemning terrorism, and they've been doing that for many years, especially since 9/11, right? But the cameras are not rolling. Nobody is interested. We had, I think, one demonstration against violent extremism by Muslims in London, which was like thousands of them walking in the streets and raising banners and not under my name. This is not Islam. Violence is against Islam. Nobody paid attention. You had many scholars, many imams writing this long letter to Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, saying, what you're doing is not Islam. Come on, this is not Islam. Here are all the, the verses from the Holy Quran, from the Hadith of the Prophet, the sayings of the Prophet, that completely say that you are on the wrong path. What you are doing is totally un-Islamic. It's actually against Islam, right? Again, it was not amplified enough. As I said, one part of the problem is that Muslims are speaking, but they're not heard because there isn't sufficient interest in actually amplifying these voices. And then there is the psychological pressure, which I also talked about when I said, being apologetic every time something bad happens, or being on the defensive, or feeling that you have to hide, or feeling that you have to justify, or feeling that you have to speak on behalf of 1.8 billion Muslims. Absolutely emotionally and psychologically draining and exhausting in every sense of the word. And it's really something which I would say is very unhealthy. So I think the right approach is to say, yes, I'm against extremism, but I cannot possibly be someone who actually come out and speak on behalf of 1.8 billion Muslims and feel like I have to sit on the confession seat, right? Or I have to defend myself and explain my faith every time something bad happens somewhere around the world. So it's not fair, it's not just, it's not right. So I think you need to really kind of strike this balance. And I think that when I said that you're being proactive rather than reactive, I also meant not just condemning terrorism, but I meant going out and trying to build relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims. And one way to do so, like I said, if you're a Muslim parent, go out and attend every single, parent-teacher meeting. Be part of the community, plant a tree. Let's clean the park together. Let's make sure our neighborhood is clean. Let's worry about environmental issues, climate change, the quality of education, and so much more, so that you are part and parcel of the fabric of your society. So the next time your neighbor sees something horrible about Islam, you can say, you know what? This report on the news, there is something off here. There's something wrong with this messaging, because I know my neighbors who happen to be Muslim are very good people. That's what I meant when I said being proactive rather than reactive. I did not mean just condemning terrorism. I meant engagement, getting to know each other, I think is a very important thing.
Thank you for this really informative talk. Be a little bit more. I think Say that these kind of greatness or the community. What are your example, especially in a for the help of great, you could work with community, you know, and very quickly, at 10, World War I. That I think perhaps the British experience in America is really about building institutional power. Building that so that there is just cost associated. Political cost, economic cost, social cost. That's very different from, you know, I think it's kind of like everyday engagement is important. But you see, Jonas, if you look at that initiative and you think of it as an environment that is bigger, and this is actually I would say that I think there was missing here. I used to talk to but I do think that Muslim organizations that this kind of scarce resources one day build institutions that are build institutional strength, whether it's on economics or politics. That part of it, I would be much more enjoyable, right? And much more underexposed.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And even we're talking about the multifaceted problem like Islamophobia, right? Or anti-Semitism, racism. These are they're difficult, complex, multifaceted issues or challenges. You obviously cannot just fight it with a single parent teacher. And even when I said community engagement, community activism, that's definitely one right way to do it, but it's not the only right way. So I totally agree with you on the importance of institutions, and I think some Muslim organizations are now realizing the importance of investing in this, exactly what you're saying now, preparing more Muslims who can run for office. We are seeing now, the first, Muslim congresswomen, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, in Congress. There are now organizations that try to train and try to prepare, young Muslims who take lead in terms of being political figures, running for office, running for election at the local as well as the national level. So I think there is now growing, I would say, interest as well as attention and awareness of the importance of what you just described right now in terms of the institutional aspect, in terms of spending money and funds in this direction, preparing leaders of the future, politicians of the future, encouraging them to run for office. Definitely, that's a very important part. And of course, the legislative part as well, right? So anti-Semitism became like a law or a crime. So Islamophobia after this moment is not like that. So I mean, there is also a need to think about the legal terms, right? And think about coming up with some kind maybe of regulations or some kind of legislation that can help us to get to a point where we have multiple defenses, so to speak, right? So you have the media part, you have the social media, you have the legislative part, you have the legal part, you have the institutional part, and the political part. And I think that, yeah, absolutely, I totally agree with you on your take on that. Thank you.
I am mindful of the time, and do you have another question?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, to follow on Sean's question, I was thinking about the other side of this problem, which is the infrastructure and funding in place to propagate Islamophobic discourse. And I was just remembering when David Horowitz spoke here, very first semester on campus.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the college of Horowitz brother. And at that time, early in my career, I was very idealistic. I remember Rob explicitly did not want to go to that. I did not go.
But I wrote to the brown and white.
He wrote to the brown and white. But I thought at the time, I can help change the conversation. I can ask penetrating questions. And 13 years later, I'm not sure if I've made any difference. I guess I'm weary of I've become more skeptical of the amount of difference that education can make, right? Reaching out to those people on the other side of the equation with the right information. If the last 5 years have shown us anything, it's that the demand for support for hateful speech and hateful narratives and hateful propaganda can be so much stronger than whatever facts you may have, whatever evidence you may have at your disposal. I've become kind of discouraged at the idea that the truths that I have as a scholar can be effective against all of that propaganda and the money and the institutions that are raised propaganda. Right? So as much as I want to live in a world where we just need to reach out to people and promote these kinds of exchanges and relationships, which is beautiful. We have to remember that there is that other side out there that wants to stop all that from happening, and that's very well funded. And I don't know if I have a particular question for you, but it seems to me that this is an important caveat that you have to bear in mind when we're thinking about.
Absolutely, 100% correct. In fact, one of the institutions I mentioned, which is CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, published a report a few years ago, which is called the Islamophobia Industry. So basically, they were talking exactly what you just described right now, which is basically that there is a lot of money, like billions of dollars, that are being poured into this Islamophobia industry, the industry of creating fear of the other, in this case, particularly fear of Islam and Muslims, in a very, very systematic, very, I would say, rigorous way, and with all of this huge backing and funding behind it. But, as they say, all it takes for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing, right? So I think that, you're definitely doing something important because you attended the lecture, you tried to make your point, you're contributing to your scholarship, you being here this evening. I think that every one of us is a drop in the ocean, right? And we need to add to each other's, contribution, because if we don't do that, if we don't speak up and we don't amplify our voices, then the platform is left only, right, for others. And we cannot afford that. We cannot afford that. We have to make our voices heard, even though we are not maybe as well funded as they are. That's for sure. That's for sure. But we still have to do our part. And I would just say also to put some light at the end of the tunnel. Remember now, as I said before, social media is a game changer. Why am I saying that? Because in the past, all you had was just the mainstream media, which is basically all you need to have $2 million or more in order to create a TV studio. Right now, you can start your own broadcast, your own blog, your own podcast, your own program, your own YouTube show from the comfort of your own living room. That's a message for young people here, as well as those online. You can really start your own show and your own program online, and you can have, hundreds of thousands of followers and viewers and listeners, and you can try to contribute your own knowledge and wisdom and amplify the message beyond just the audience in a single lecture or a single classroom or a single meeting or a single interfaith event, by making sure your views and voices are amplified. So you have this platform that exists now at your fingertips that did not exist in the past, and as much as it's being used for evil purposes, it can also be used for good purpose. So let's not forget that. Let's keep just doing our part and contributing our own wisdom and knowledge and expertise and trying to amplify our voices as much as possible. That's the very best we can do. It's very important. Thank you.
Thank you to those who have made it here to be present, and thanks to those who've been on Zoom. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you in future events as we start emerging from our caves back into the real world here in the next couple of months. Hope that continues. And join me in thanking Professor Khamis for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for all those who came and also those who joined us online. And thanks again to Professor Rob and the Center and the University. Thank you so much.